Hello, this is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv. Well, here we are with yet another episode in misunderstood, misrepresented, misremembered women. Today, Phaedra. Today's episode is also special in that it is both a regular narrative episode of the podcast and one of the conversation episodes I've been releasing throughout the month because, frankly, I just ended up with extra content. So I decided to put my conversation with Jennifer Saint, author of the upcoming and much anticipated novel Ariadne, into this episode of Phaedra. Jenny and I talked about Phaedra and how her story has been handled and understood in sources and in later representation. And Jenny will also be back on the show later in a couple of months or so to talk about her novel of Phaedra's sister, Ariadne. That means that Friday's episode is going to be my conversation with Dr. Ellie Mackin Roberts, author of Heroines of Olympus, about, yes, that's right, everyone's favorite, Persephone. And oh my god, did Ellie tell me some fascinating things about Persephone's mythology and history that I had no idea existed. It blew my whole mind. I can't wait for you guys to hear it on Friday. But that's Friday. Today is all about Phaedra. I went back and forth about Phaedra and how to handle her story because, well, not only is it tied to the worst mortal man of all Greek mythology, Theseus, but it's also generally dark for Phaedra and beyond. I debated doing episodes retelling the play Hippolytus by Euripides, which is what Phaedra is most famous for, but we're not going to go there because, quite frankly, it's problematic as all hell. Instead, I want to tell you about the woman beyond that dark chapter that made her both famous and infamous. This is episode 118, Phaedra and the Curse of Theseus, and a conversation with Jennifer Saint. Phaedra's heritage and family we know quite well, even if she is often forgotten or glossed over in it. Because Phaedra was, as you might remember, a princess of Crete. For a full rundown of what exactly happened with that poor family on Crete, you can listen to episode 79, that is LXXIX. But to recap, Phaedra was the daughter of King Minos, son of Zeus and Europa, and Queen Pasiphae, sister of Circe and sometimes a witch herself. To say this was a dysfunctional family would be the understatement of a lifetime. Pasiphae was cursed due to her husband's hubris. She was cursed to love a bull and gave birth to the Minotaur because of it. Her children by Minos were forced to watch all of this, to watch their mother go through what must have been a horrifically traumatic experience. And the children of Minos and Pasiphae that we're concerned with here are Ariadne and Phaedra, the only two daughters. Phaedra watched as her sister escaped their life on Crete with this handsome prince of Athens, Theseus, who she helped to defeat the Minotaur. As all this happened, as all of their lives changed forever, as their half-brother was killed and Ariadne taken away, Phaedra watched. Phaedra watched as her sister got away from what we can assume was a pretty bad situation. She escaped and, as I'm sure Phaedra believed, was brought to Athens, where she married Theseus and became queen, able to just live happily ever after. All of this Phaedra watched. The character of Phaedra herself often gets lost behind her half-brother, the monstrous Minotaur, and his horrifying heritage, and behind her sister, Ariadne, who left with Theseus. She gets lost behind Ariadne, even beyond Ariadne and Theseus, because in the end, she marries a god, Dionysus. But when does Phaedra learn that her sister didn't actually end up with Theseus? That's the question I'm most interested in, and it's one we don't really have an answer to. Phaedra's story is told primarily in Euripides' play Hippolytus. It's also in Ovid's much later work, the Heroides. But what of Phaedra in the ancient world before the play by Euripides? It's really hard to say anything about her story beyond Hippolytus. How Phaedra ends up marrying Theseus isn't clear in many of the sources. She's just married to him. It's reasonable to understand their marriage as one of diplomacy. This is suggested in some sources. I can't find a primary one, but very smart people reference it, and I trust them. This diplomatic marriage comes later in both of their lives, presumably long after, although certainly at some point after, Theseus straight abandoned her own sister, Ariadne, on the island of Naxos. It happened after he raped an Amazon, either Antiope or Hippolyta. Whichever Amazonian queen it may have been, bared his child, Hippolytus, who was sent to be raised in Theseus' hometown of Troezen. From there, stories of the horrors of Theseus vary, but ultimately he raped tens of women before he married Phaedra. And it's safe to assume he married Phaedra to keep the peace. Theseus was king of Athens by that time, after, of course, causing the death of his father. He's king of Athens, and Athens and Crete would like to remain at peace after their more dramatic relationship with the Minotaur and his Athenian victims. So, Phaedra married Theseus. Basic understanding of human emotions and interactions might tell you that she probably wasn't particularly happy with this. After all, she'd first met him when he ran off with her sister, and then what? Well, there was the time he had a child with an Amazon, and the time he kidnapped the very, very young Helen of Sparta, among many, many other women. Yes, this was the man she was getting to marry. If you want to imagine things started out just a little better for Phaedra, there is the possibility that she actually believed her sister had died through no fault of Theseus's, instead of straight up knowing that he abandoned her. In that case, Phaedra may have only seen Theseus being kind and attentive to her sister before they left Crete, and she could have been under the impression that he would be the same to her when they were married. But that is where the positivity ends, because ultimately she married Theseus, a man even Plutarch thought was pretty shit to women. That Phaedra and Theseus' relationship lacked love is a fact we have across most, if not all, sources. She doesn't love her husband. He's a monster. They do, however, have 2 children. We can now recognize that Theseus was, by far, the so-called hero who was most violent towards women. But even then, in the mythology, objectively, he was not a catch for Phaedra beyond his being king. And when these myths are first told, too, Athens wasn't anything special. So he didn't even have that going for him. He was just a random king of a random city-state in ancient Greece. Not to mention the origins of these are probably Cretan myths, in which case they didn't have any desire to make Athens look good. Theseus was just a guy who killed the Minotaur and did a bunch of other horrific shit. But that is Phaedra's lot, and there isn't anything she can do about it. She's at the whim of her brother, the new king of Crete by that point, and the husband he gave her to, the literal worst, Theseus. And yet, the story Phaedra is most famous for is, again, that of Hippolytus. Hippolytus was Theseus' son by the Amazonian queen, whoever she may be. Pop culture and more recent receptions of Phaedra's story would have you believe she was a seductress, that she set out to seduce her stepson, that when he rejected her out of his piety towards Artemis, the goddess he devoted himself to, that Phaedra died by suicide, leaving a note that accused him of raping her. That obviously is not the whole story, nor is it an accurate representation of Phaedra's motivations. The reason I'm not telling you the story of Euripides' play, Hippolytus, is that last detail. Phaedra falsely accuses Hippolytus of raping her. I'm not even going to dip my toe into the idea of false rape accusations, lest anyone believe that it is an actual problem, when it is not. At all. Instead, we're going to talk about Phaedra's true motivations, how she got to that place, and how she felt about it. Because none of Phaedra's tragedy is on her. As with so many stories like these, where the woman is reduced to a caricature, a mess of horrible stereotypes and misconceptions, Phaedra was cursed by a god. Or possibly even inadvertently cursed by her own sister. Because when Theseus abandoned Ariadne on Naxos, some sources have her uttering a curse upon him and his family. A family which Ariadne could have never foreseen would have ultimately included her own sister. But even in Euripides' famous telling of Hippolytus, it's Aphrodite pulling the strings on Phaedra, and not for anything she did, but for the actions of a man, Hippolytus. A woman whose tragic fate is determined by the actions of a man in angering a god. How very familiar. It's even like a family curse in a way, because the same thing happened to her poor mother, Pasiphae. Hippolytus ignored Aphrodite, even spurned her worship, in favor of Artemis. One might want to be impressed by a young man wanting to worship the so-called virgin goddess of the hunt, Artemis, and we should be to an extent. It's just that it results in Aphrodite's hatred of him, her desire to ruin his life. And enter his stepmother, Phaedra, who meets Hippolytus when he's a young man and she is probably middle-aged. It depends on how you play the story, but she certainly wasn't that much older than him given everything that had happened. Aphrodite caused Phaedra to be completely, utterly in love with Hippolytus. A love that is all-encompassing and overpowering. It's yet another example of the fate of a woman being the means of punishing a man. In Ovid's Heroides, which are letters written by women to men who harmed them in one way or another, Phaedra details how her love of Hippolytus is, in truth, her first love, how she never loved her husband, Theseus, and therefore is in a way untouched by him. She believes herself to be pure and awaiting Hippolytus because she'd never experienced anything that felt like love. In Euripides, again, it's all the work of Aphrodite in her desire to punish Hippolytus. Regardless of what you read, though, Phaedra is sympathetic. She's either a woman overtaken by the powers of a god or a woman who's never before experienced real love, real passion, due to her arranged marriage with an absolutely horrific man we all hate. She's not a seductress. She's not manipulative. She's manipulated. Even in Hippolytus, the problematic play she's most famous for, Phaedra doesn't initially want to cause any trouble. She loves Hippolytus due to Aphrodite's machinations, but she doesn't even want to act on it. She wants to keep her passions to herself, keep them secret. She'd rather die than reveal the shame of her feelings, than cause the shame for her husband. It's actually her nurse that ultimately causes it to become known, telling Hippolytus and unraveling the whole mess. And for his part, Hippolytus is a true asshole in the play. He's a real son of Theseus. Phaedra, in the end, dies by suicide when she knows her secret is out. But there's a note left behind, accusing Hippolytus of rape. Again, this is why I don't want to tell the play explicitly, but I think it's important to mention. This note causes Theseus to curse his son, to exile him, and Hippolytus is eventually killed on his way from the city, when a bull roars from the sea and startles his horses. But not before Hippolytus goes on a wildly misogynistic rant. Because again, he's the son of Theseus. And that is the Phaedra of Euripides' Hippolytus, but it isn't the ultimate interpretation of Phaedra. Phaedra is a product of the stories around her. She's a product of the tragedy of her family, her father's mistakes, and the way her mother was punished for them. She's a product of her marriage to Theseus, one she surely didn't seek out on her own. She's a product of the machinations of the gods. Through it all, though, Phaedra pushed back on her fate as much as she could. She tried to keep her passions to herself. She realized the severity of her feelings. She tried and tried. Phaedra's story was, for the most part, just her varied attempts to survive the life she'd been given. And that, listeners, is Phaedra beyond Hippolytus. Unfortunately, her story is linked to the play so much that she isn't left with much beyond it, so I realized today's episode was a little bit funny, but I wanted to talk about her. I think she's really important, and I think that she's really misunderstood. But the episode isn't over because I spoke with Jennifer Saint, author of the upcoming book Ariadne, which I personally am so excited for. We talked all about Phaedra, how Jenny approached Phaedra's story in her book, and generally just how we both understand Phaedra as a character. It was really interesting, and I'm so excited for you to hear it. So here is that conversation. But a very quick note, a couple minutes of our initial audio was very bad, like unlistenable. I've kept the sort of welcome message so that it wasn't so awkward and you can kind of hear what it sounded like and why I otherwise had to cut that section. It was only a couple minutes it was lost. We just chatted about how Phaedra got to be with Theseus in the first place, something I've already told you, so you are not missing out. But I'm explaining because what you'll hear of the conversation sort of leaps into her life with Theseus. Jenny and I had a fascinating chat about the intricacies of Phaedra, these variations on her, and as usual, just how shit Theseus was. Thank you so much for talking to me today. I'm here with Jennifer Saint, author of the forthcoming novel Ariadne, which I am so excited to read. And you will be back, though, to talk about Ariadne because today is all about Phaedra.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me.
All right, so yeah, Phaedra and Theseus. I think one thing too is Phaedra's so, I suppose, overshadowed by the story of Ariadne.
Yeah.
And also her story has almost no good bits versus Ariadne's, which does.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's an interesting sort of dynamic between those two. And as you say, you're right, there's not really any stories of them appearing together. We're sort of just told that they're siblings, but there's so little representation of them having any kind of relationship.
Yeah, and I was just really interested in what that relationship would have been. And I thought, like you say, Phaedra is such a tragic character, whereas Ariadne has got more adventure, more kind of joyfulness in some of her story. And yeah, so I think when it came to developing Phaedra, I thought about why that difference might be with them as well. And I imagined that with Ariadne, perhaps she had known a time before the Minotaur, whereas Phaedra is younger, kind of coming up behind her sister. Perhaps she's always lived with this horror in the palace, these terrible sacrifices being made to the monster. And then Ariadne is the one who runs away with the hero, who must have been, as horrendous as we consider him to be, he must have had an appeal for Ariadne, at least at first. And I kind of imagined Phaedra as the younger sister, the one in the shadows, like you say, seeing her sister do this kind of exciting, adventurous thing, and then it's Phaedra who ends up actually living the reality of that. It was sort of what Ariadne wanted, and Phaedra's the one who gets it. And it turns out to be a disaster.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you're right. I think it's important that we recognize, as much as we consider Theseus to be awful, I mean, there's certainly a reason that Ariadne went off with him. And by all respect, I mean, he was a hero. He did appear heroic. The most troubling thing about him is kind of how everyone just ended up ruined because of him, but it all sort of happened after the fact, so you really don't see him coming. It's like he sneaks up on you and then suddenly your life is over.
Definitely. He must have had some kind of charisma, some kind of glamour about him.
Yeah, yeah. Really, he must have been really handsome. He must have been really charming. Just kind of like sociopath level, just like really reel you in into thinking that he's not going to completely ruin your life.
But then he does.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know how much we want to go into your book, and like I said, I haven't gotten it yet, so I haven't read it yet. But I definitely want, I mean, you'll be back, thankfully, to talk about your book and Ariadne specifically. But do you want to give any kind of information about how you went about researching, like what you've learned as you wrote this book about Ariadne? But I'm sure Phaedra plays a considerable role.
Yeah, she does. Well, I did a lot of research where I started writing, and then approaching it as a writer, I kind of had to forget a lot of it to turn Phaedra into a character that existed for me, that was my interpretation of her. So then I had to research her all over again for this podcast. I was like, oh my God, I have to remember it all. But what was really important to me with Phaedra is I wanted to tell a story from a feminist perspective. And the problematic thing about Phaedra's story is that it perpetuates this myth that false rape allegations are a more common thing than they are. So I had to be really careful. I had to really think about, well, what story do I want to tell about Phaedra? Because I don't want to tell that one. And, when I was looking at that aspect of her story, I was writing actually kind of shortly after the Me Too hashtag took off. That was really present in my mind. And it was so obviously such a common experience for women to be harassed, to be assaulted, it was such a shocking hashtag because you suddenly realise this is everywhere. This is so pervasive. This is part of this dominant culture. And Phaedra's story exists in this culture where false rape allegations are so rare. Perhaps 4% of rape allegations are false. That's the statistic from the Home Office in the UK, so obviously not worldwide. But it's kind of between 2 and 6%, I think, in Europe and the US. So it's very low. But the belief that women make false allegations about this is so much more prevalent. And I think if that's the case, that reflects something about the culture that we're living in, the narrative that is prevailing. And I really didn't want to do anything that would contribute to that. So I really wanted to tell Phaedra's story, and I really wanted to tell it in a different way. And I won't kind of give away the book before anybody reads it, because it's not out yet. But yeah, that I would definitely say that I approached that differently.
Well, I think that's really important, and because you're right, it is a story of a false rape allegation, which is definitely not something that, like you say, regularly happens, and we don't want to perpetuate the idea that it happens at all, let alone as, a major issue or the story of the, downfall of a man because a woman did this. It's
exactly.
There's lots of varied versions, it seems, about kind of how she got in that position, how he reacted, and why. And it seems like there isn't, not that there's regularly a consensus in mythology on anything, but in this story specifically, those little details seem to vary a lot from what I've read.
Yeah. And I know when I started researching her, I always I've got the Oxford Classical Dictionary from when I was at university, like 100 years ago. And you go there and you look at Phaedra and it just says, see Hippolytus. So she doesn't merit her in entry. And then it tells you that there are lost plays about her. So there was Euripides wrote one before the one that we know. And there's a Sophocles play as well, both of which apparently portrayed her, I've got the quote, as lustful and unscrupulous.
Yep, I read that just now as I tried to prep for this as well. I was like, oh, gross. And also a bummer for Euripides. Like, I always want to think better for him, but it seems not.
He must have rethought things. It obviously didn't go down very well, because in the one that we know, the Hippolytus, she comes across as a lot more sympathetic. She's much more of an innocent victim. She's like afflicted with this terrible passion, but she's prepared to die rather than act on it. It's only that the nurse betrays her. It's the nurse that goes to Hippolytus and says, Phaedra's in love with you, maybe you should have an affair with her. And the play is called Hippolytus, but he doesn't come across very sympathetically. He goes on to an
Mm-hmm.
enormous rant about how awful women are. So you don't feel that bad when, the bull comes out of the sea and kills him. So yeah, but I studied that play when I was doing my A levels, so I was 17. So it's also in the past.
That's interesting. So I like the idea that Euripides learned, or sort of adapted his thought process on it. It's an interesting thing to specifically compare her to Ariadne too. Like you said, she sort of gets the life that Ariadne thought she was getting,
Mm-hmm.
and it turned out to be so not what anyone probably wanted for themselves. And then
Yeah.
Ariadne, of course, has her own issues on what version you want to believe in terms of how her life turned out, but I will
Yeah.
always go with she married a god and lived happily ever after. So much better than she died for no good reason on an island.
Yeah.
Yeah, but then the comparison of having her sister have that tragic fate is such an interesting juxtaposition.
Yeah, and I thought there's something so poignant in it to kind of I think as like a younger sister always wanting to be like your older sisters, and then when you get there and you find out, oh no, I'm married to Theseus.
Yeah. Oh, look what my life is now. This man killed his father because he simply couldn't remember the basic instructions of changing the colors of his sails.
Because he was so busy getting away from your sister who he left to die.
Exactly. Such a good guy. What kind of drew you to these characters in the first place?
It was, well, I mean, really, it was just that when I was at university, that's when I read Ovid's Heroides, and I
Mm.
just loved that idea of these women having a voice. And so Phaedra's letter in the Heroides formed a really big part of the Phaedra in my book. So I was really interested in that idea, but I finished university, I went off to be a teacher. It's kind of in the back of my mind for a long time. And then it was probably when I was reading Greek myths, like, children's Greek myths to my own sons. And we were reading Theseus and the Minotaur, and it just said, Ariadne helped him, gave him the thread, and then he left her. And the story just didn't come back to her. I was like, she got, a couple of sentences. And even my son, who absolutely loves Greek mythology, he was like, well, what happened to her? And I just thought, hey, there's a story that really needs to be told.
Absolutely. I mean, she really is the complete brains behind him
Mm,
succeeding against the Minotaur. And then, yeah, to have her story be so forgotten and sort of ignored in place of Theseus that's always something that's felt very problematic to me as well. And I
yeah,
think, yeah, she's very ripe for a novelization.
yeah.
When it comes to Phaedra, do you have anything that's really stood out for you in terms of her character?
So obviously, I used the Euripides play Hippolytus to kind of as a starting point, and then I kind of went from that what I didn't really want Phaedra to be, because she's such a victim in that play,
Mm.
and there's that kind of like irony in the way that it's Aphrodite, and of course Phaedra's mother Pasiphae. The same thing really happens here. She was cursed to fall in love, but it's the Phaedra in Ovid's Heroides that I just thought she is such an interesting character, because she's so clever and she's so passionate in that letter, and she's so unashamed as well. She's got all of this clever rhetoric, all of these reasons why Hippolytus should fall in love with her back, and she's not apologetic for it at
Mm.
all. And I thought that is a great woman to write about.
Yeah, I agree. Almost like, the idea being Theseus was so awful and she just happened to fall in love with another guy who, I mean, fine, was his son, but less so about any kind of coercion or any of the more problematic bits, and really just a woman who's in love.
Yeah, and the fact that it's Theseus' son, but he is so unlike Theseus. I sort of thought, if she's been married to Theseus for however many years, and in the Euripides play, they are living in exile, aren't they? Because Theseus has murdered somebody.
Of course.
Oh, yeah. In, I think, Seneca play, which I didn't use very much, but that opens, Theseus is absent because he's gone to the underworld to abduct Persephone, and so he's not around. And then you have Hippolytus, who is devoted to Artemis, and he wants to stay virginal, and he just wants to, run with his dogs and his horses to the mountains. I thought he's the absolute opposite of Theseus, and for somebody married to Theseus, you can see why he would have represented something so appealing to Phaedra. And even beyond who he is himself, I thought, that the intensity of her infatuation, I thought about this when I was listening to your episode with, is it Yentl?
Mm-hmm. On Dionysus.
Yeah, on Dionysus. And when she talked about Harry Styles fans getting in touch with her. And I thought that intense infatuation is something I think most teenage girls go through. It's really relatable, and it's not really about the object of infatuation. It's about you and your feelings. And I just thought for Phaedra, Hippolytus, it doesn't matter who Hippolytus is. Like, number one, he's not Theseus, and number two, he's not her life in Athens. He's something completely different. And in the Heroides, she talks about how she wants to run off to the forest with the hounds and hunt deer and do all these things that she's never done before. And I thought, it doesn't matter about Hippolytus. She just wants to be free.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I mean, he is the child of an Amazon too. So if you ignore the Theseus of it all, he's the son of an Amazonian queen. Like, it seems the best and most realistic version to put him as somebody who does want to go off with Artemis and be in the woods and hunting and everything. I wonder, did you catch the German Street Theatre production of the 15 Heroines?
No, I didn't see it. I really wish I had done.
In this 15 Heroines, Phaedra was very, like Ariadne, they had a very young actress, and she was sort of brilliant and cunning and very fascinating. And then Phaedra was very like stately and regal and just like almost the opposite of Ariadne in a way that I think really shows what she had to go through.
Yeah.
To be by being with Theseus and then, falling for somebody else almost because her husband was such a mess. And the idea of it taking place while he is off kidnapping the goddess of the underworld, adds such an extra level of why she might want to get away from him at all costs.
Yeah, well, you're just immediately on her side, I think, as soon as the play opens.
Yeah. I need to read more Roman plays. I almost never do. I'll read like snippets of them online, but I think Seneca is probably worth the time, at least, especially in that case.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't read any more, but I also need to.
Yeah, I know he also wrote a version of Medea that I'm interested in. But I just always focus on the Greek, obviously, or Ovid.
Yeah, that's really what I do as well.
I can't wait to cover more of the Heroides, because they really are something else when it comes to that. There are some stories that he tells that are so perfect in the way he portrays them. I love his Medea in the Metamorphoses. Obviously love his Medusa. Things like that, were quite innovative, but not necessarily everything.
Yeah.
So when it comes to Theseus in the story of Phaedra, does he tend to be, I mean, certainly in these plays, it's a little bit different than the mythology we have of him, which is quite a bit more overt, at least in terms of how we're able to see it now and analyze it, that he is quite horrific. But I'm interested to hear your thoughts on the play version of Theseus and Ovid's version of Theseus.
Well, I mean, I love it in the Heroides how angry Phaedra is with Theseus, and like she doesn't hold back. I think she calls him Aegeus's lying son. There's something in there that she says. It's Theseus and his son together have been the destruction of two sisters. So she really like pins it on him, which is the other sort of interpretation of Phaedra that you can have with what she does. You know, if you want to kind of go with, actually she is making a malicious allegation, she is trying to destroy this family, then you do think she's got fairly extreme provocation for doing so, given what Theseus has done to her family already. That, you know, he's destroyed them. And does she know what happened to Ariadne, or is she married to this man, always wondering what really went on Naxos? Where is Ariadne now? So her anger does kind of, I think, lend a certain like mitigation to what she does. And I like that Ovid doesn't hold back from that he really kind of has her give vent to how furious she is with him. I think in the Euripides play, he just comes across as a little bit slow, like dim-witted, because he doesn't really have he's not the interesting part of the play, is he? It's Phaedra and Hippolytus, and then he gets so angry straight away. And this is the other thing that I thought, that he's so quick to believe that Hippolytus has done this to his wife, even though, shouldn't he know that his son is dedicated to Artemis? Shouldn't he know that his son has sworn off women altogether, that he's the last person that would do that? And I think, well, doesn't that tell you something about Theseus, that he can't believe his son? He's more willing to believe his son is a rapist than he is to believe that his son is a devoted follower of Artemis. And I think that just shows you exactly what Theseus is like. And then, of course, he calls upon the vengeance on Hippolytus, and then he laments it afterwards.
Yeah, right. Of course, I'll cause your death, and then I'll feel bad about it, but it's far too late for that. I think it's important to remember too, his son is, as much as he is also the son of an Amazon, he's the son of an Amazon once more by assault. You know, the Amazons didn't go with Theseus willingly.
No.
And so she had this child. The child went to live with Theseus's original family and then grew up without him, and was the product of this horrible relationship. I mean, there's just so many things going on that are still always the fault of Theseus in whatever way, that it just seems like, of course, he'll just be kind of awful and stupid and just kind of there to perform the acts of the play versus playing a kind of important or interesting role.
Yeah, and that's the thing that I think just annoys me about Theseus the most, that he is always just kind of performing these acts, these like big heroic adventurous acts, but he's not really an interesting person in himself. So why does he get all the glory?
He's just sort of doing it because that's what heroes are meant to do. And even if you give him a bit of the benefit of the doubt, that's true, because when he's a child, you know, his cousin is Heracles who comes to visit, and he just like decides that he wants to be like Heracles.
Yeah.
So I don't think he does anything for any good reasons. He just wants the fame and the glory, and he's willing to kind of do whatever it takes to get that. Like in the case of traveling from treason to Athens in the first place, and just killing all these people that we're supposed to believe deserved it. But it seems to me he just always is looking to arrive at a place with glory, and he'll lie about how he got it if he has to.
Yeah, definitely. And I think he would have been telling Ariadne all the stories of everything he'd done on the way to Athens to claim his birthright, and leaving out a lot that might have changed her mind.
Exactly. I mean, I stand by, I think he's just a serial killer. The likelihood that there were so many people that just so deserve death in such creative ways on that road, I mean, it just seems implausible.
Just a little.
The Heroides, as I'm remembering the performance again, which just sticks in my head completely now, that every time I think of Ovid's Heroides, she mentions a lot, I believe, about how he killed her brother as well.
Yeah.
And I think it's one of those things that's often, I mean, it depends on the sourcing too, about how people seem to feel about it or talk about it. But, you know, he did kidnap her sister Ariadne, abandoned her on an island. And like you say, it's unclear whether Phaedra knows what happened to her sister or whether it's just a horrible mystery. But he also did kill the Minotaur, which was their brother. And certainly he was a monstrous brother, yes. But it's very possible there was still some kind of of familial relationship there, where the brother's death would be, an affecting thing to happen to a family. And Ariadne helped, but of course, you can dive into quite how much of that was because she was sort of under Theseus's creepy, charming spell. But Phaedra had nothing to do with it. So the idea that she possibly blamed him also for the death of her brother in all this is certainly, it's possible. And I think it's an interesting thing to think about as well, whether that also is another thing that she feels that Theseus did that, is sort of irredeemable.
Yeah, definitely. And I suppose their feelings about the Minotaur would just be so complex. And given the way that he's born and that it's this terrible punishment visited on their mother for the crimes of their father, I just thought, what does that do to your family anyway? What does that do to your psyche to grow up with that as an example of what happens to women? And you can kind of see, I suppose, in a way, her just wanting to turn the tables, just thinking, well, it's always women paying the price for men's actions. Finally, when she's really backed into a corner, when the nurse has betrayed her, when she thinks that her sons might be disinherited, because she's going to be shamed for this love that she can't control, then she does the only thing that she can think of to do and thinks, well, finally, a man can pay the price for something at last.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Gosh, it's just, the things that Theseus has done that, deserve punishment, but also, like you're saying, that their family is just, there's just so many horrible things to have happened to one family, especially when it comes to the women of the family. It's quite the case of one of those horribly cursed Greek mythological families without there being kind of an explicit curse on them,
No, just a series of bad luck.
Yeah, exactly. Like, at least when it comes to, the House of Atreus or the Tantalids or whatever you want to call them, that's an explicit curse. It's multiple curses. So when something bad happens, it's like, well, our family's very cursed. But maybe because it's all happening to women on Crete, it seems less about a curse and more about just Greek mythology's tendency towards raining havoc on unsuspecting women.
Yeah. And I think, the Phaedra that comes across in the Heroides as well, she does come up with all of these arguments for why Hippolytus should fall in love with her, and she kind of sets them all out really cleverly. And I thought, that really shows, it shows how clever she is, obviously, and how persuasive, but also I think that she doesn't really have an understanding of how love works, because you can't really argue somebody into falling in love with you. And I thought about, why that would be for Phaedra. She hasn't had an experience of it. I can't imagine that she witnessed much of a loving relationship between her parents, given everything. And then obviously she's been shipped off and married to Theseus. And I thought she argues that she's as virginal as Hippolytus because she's never loved before. And I think she is quite, as kind of clever and passionate as she is, quite emotionally stunted in that way, that she just doesn't really understand what love is, and so maybe doesn't recognize that what she has for Hippolytus isn't really love. It's
right,
something else, about her dissatisfaction with her life.
Yeah, that's really interesting, and sort of an added level of tragedy in there. That she's in a position where she just thinks, well, I can just convince him to love me because I have all these good reasons, and surely that's how it works, because she just doesn't know any better. That's very interesting and sad.
Yeah, well, her story is such a tragic one, but I just think so worth exploring, because she's so interesting. There's so many layers.
Yeah, that's so true. It's sort of rare, I think, that I cover a woman's story that is just like pure tragedy. Fascinating and really complex, but really just unfortunate tragedy throughout. I don't think she really has many good things happen to her.
No. Well, this is what happens, I suppose, if you're covering the story of Theseus's wife, Theseus, the unfortunate woman that has to be married to him.
Yeah, God, the list he goes through. Such a mess of a hero.
But I think she wasn't she wasn't as big a part of the book when I started writing it. But every person who read an early draft just said, well, we just want more Phaedra, you put more of her story in, and she just kept growing and growing throughout. So I thought, well, clearly there is something about her that people want to know more.
Yeah, I think that's very true. I'm glad to hear that she's in it a lot. I'm very, very much looking forward to your book. Now, like I said, you know, we will be back to discuss the book more explicitly closer to the release. But is there anything you want to talk about it right now? And I mean, certainly tell us when it comes out and maybe a little bit more about it.
Yeah, so it comes out in the UK on the 29th of April and in America on May the 4th, and I am not sure about Canada.
It does come out of the American date in Canada. I've checked.
Okay, great. Thanks. Yeah, and it is so a retelling of the myth of the Minotaur from Ariadne's perspective, and exploring why she behaved the way she did, what was it that drew her to Theseus, there must have been something, and what happened to her afterwards.
Very exciting. Gosh, so much Greek mythology content all the time. I love it. It seems like the world is so ready for so much of it right now, and I think we're in such an ideal time for it. So very excited to read it.
Can't get enough of these books coming out. But yeah, I suppose the thing is as well, when you're putting Greek mythology into a novel, you do have to make up a coherent chronology. So I think
chronology.
yeah, because that just doesn't exist in the myth. So
it does not.
I did have to kind of make up a lot of I just decided what age I wanted them to be and how I wanted it to work and when the Minotaur would have been brought into existence, because nothing makes any sense, does it?
Oh my god, no.
So I think writing a novel about these characters, I suppose when I listen to your podcast quite often, you have, academics on and you have historians on, and I learn so much hearing them talk. But I really approached it as I wanted to tell a story and I wanted them to be kind of characters that I could believe in. So
yeah.
So I did have to make them something maybe different to how they might appear in other versions.
I think that's so important too, though, and I'm thrilled to have talked to you about this because I think that's a very different side. Like you're saying, I am not an academic, very, very much so. And so I also love speaking with them and hearing that side of things. But I think I connect a little bit, well, sort of, I would say equally, because I also have trouble. I have trouble making things up in the mythology because I'm so obsessed with the accuracies and the various versions and accuracies that really mean 5 different things can be accurate at once and those things. So I really am appreciating speaking with someone who was able to get past that and force a story from it, because I think it is a really important skill. It's really something you have to do if you're going to write fiction based on mythology. And so I'm excited. Yeah, it's been interesting to hear how you've done that, how you've gone about it.
Well, it was a stumbling block at first because I was really caught up in I need to make it as accurate as I can, even though, it's all made up.
There wasn't a Minotaur? What are you talking about?
But I think it was when I discussed it with my agent and she was like, well, look, this whole section is really boring. Nothing happens. And I was like, well, that's because that's the myth. Yeah, but make something happen.
Yeah, I think that's certainly what an agent is good for as well, really forcing that out of you.
Very handy. So I think once I got rid of the image of a lot of angry classicists reading over my shoulder going, wrong, that didn't happen, then I could kind of write more uninhibited and just think, well, no, I don't think that Euripides was sitting there thinking I've got to make sure that my Phaedra lines up exactly with previous versions of her. It obviously wasn't, because he wrote 2 totally different Phaedras. So not that I'm comparing myself to Euripides, by the way. Just want to make that clear.
Didn't come off like that.
Okay, good.
No, but I think you're right about it. I think that's an important thing to think about, because I don't think back then they would have been so concerned, because it was just their sort of way of life. And there was nothing necessarily factual or not. I have to think about that a lot. I get a lot of listeners who, those poor unfortunate souls who start thinking about the chronology.
Oh no.
And try to try to get my help on the chronology, and every time my response is some variation of, oh, don't trouble yourself, just don't, you have to just get past it, you have to just put it out of your mind, because it's impossible. And that is the thrill of those stories, is that they were adapted and they changed and they were told over different regions, so what region would have a different version than another region, and that everything is so different, and it varied so much, and let alone chronology, god, that's just in the variations of the story itself. So I think I don't even know necessarily where my brain started this conversation from, but I mean, it's my brain is like the chronology of Greek mythology.
Yeah.
It can't even track itself. But it is one of those things, and I think that's what lends it to fiction so perfectly, is that, and now my brain got it back, of Euripides not concerning himself with it either. But I think, it lends itself to fiction because it is so sort of pliable, and you can turn it into what you want it to be. And it sort of comes back to what I experience on the internet all too often of, angry men who want to tell you what the correct version of Medusa is.
Yeah.
The so-called original myth. Mm-hmm. as if that's a thing that can possibly exist in this world. And so, I think Euripides knew it, and novelists know it now, that it is sort of, you can take these characters and do with them what you want. And I'm personally thrilled to see that so many people are coming at it like, let's do feminist retellings of it. Let's sort of take these women back from the patriarchy that came up with their stories.
Yeah, because that's what we need these myths to do now, isn't it? We need, they're brilliant stories and amazing characters, but we want them to serve a purpose for us today in the world that we're living in. So I think that feminist retellings are a really good way to do that.
Absolutely. I mean, it's certainly the same reason why I have this podcast.
Yeah.
I think there's such a perfect time for that. And it's just such an ideal situation. Everyone's kind of ready for it, other than the angry misogynists on the internet, but fuck them, it's fine.
The only other thing that I did think about was again, like in the Heroides, where she justifies what she wants to do with Hippolytus by the god's own behaviour. So I think as well, like really calling out that hypocrisy and just saying, the gods do it. So she points out Aphrodite had an affair with Adonis, Eos and Cephalus. Eos obviously slightly problematic. And
indeed.
Atalanta and I'm not going to say his name correctly, Meleager.
I don't think anyone knows how to pronounce his name. I say Meleager or Meleager, but I'm with you. I know who you're talking about.
I mean, I've changed the way that I pronounce Phaedra throughout this podcast. I think I might have said it 3 different ways already, because I mean, I learned all these names from reading them. So it was. So Atalanta and Meleager, we'll call him.
That works.
He was married, and Atalanta was devoted to Artemis, so they were kind of the reversal of Phaedra and Hippolytus. So I like the way that she, that Ovid through Phaedra really points that out, that this isn't, we were talking at the start, we said she was portrayed as lustful and unscrupulous in these earlier versions, and she's not any worse than the gods themselves.
I think that's such an important thing, and I'm very glad that it's in that version, because that's something that's so rarely used in the mythology when it could be. And I think it probably took a Roman, reasonably. I think that the Greeks wouldn't have gone there, because it would have been, I don't want to say blasphemy because that's a very Christian term, but, it would have been impiety in a very severe kind of way to say, like, well, it's fine because look what the gods do, But a Roman comes along and isn't so worried about that. And I think that is such an important point, and one that certainly makes Phaedra's feelings and, emotions in the whole situation a lot more understandable. You can just understand her as a person more, rather than sort of a caricature of a lustful or whatever kind of woman, however you want to describe her in the Hippolytus a little bit, or those earlier versions that we don't have, that sort of messy woman, the way the Greeks like to portray women.
Yeah.
Well, that's perfect point, I think, to end it on.
Mm-hmm.
She's just acting like the gods.
Yeah, so it's fine.
Yeah, exactly. It can't be so bad. But thank you so much for speaking with me today. Jennifer Saint.
Thank you.
Go with both.
Yeah.
I really appreciate it. I'm really excited to read your book and to talk to you more about it closer to and having read it.
Well, I hope it gets there soon.
Thank you so much for talking with me today.
Yeah, oh, well, thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, nerds, thank you all for listening. I was really thrilled to speak with Jenny about this, and I'm really excited to have her back on the show in the next couple of months to talk about her new novel. There's so much mythology coming out lately, and novels and books, and oh my gosh, anyway, it's a real thrill. But Friday, Dr. Ellie Mackin Roberts talks Persephone, and again, you will not want to miss it. Ellie absolutely blew my whole mind with some of the information that she had on very real women and girls who were connected with Persephone. Whew. So excited for you to hear it. For now, you're all the absolute best. I am having a blast with these special Women's History Month episodes. What a crazy month it's been. Thank you, as always. I am Liv, and I love this shit.